It's an odd sensation experiencing changes. When you're faced with relocating to a different town after spending years in one place, or when the time comes to retire from your job following decades of dedication, or even when the moment arrives for you to be released from prison. Zoe couldn't help but feel a whirlwind of emotions about today. On one hand, she was thrilled about finally being released from prison, but on the other hand, she knew this meant her life was about to undergo a major transformation. The uncertainty of what lay ahead made her feel apprehensive. After all, over the years, the prison had become a familiar place for her, almost like a home. The thought of leaving that behind and starting anew brought with it both excitement and trepidation. Within these prison walls, Zoe had forged meaningful connections with some of the other inmates. Over time, these friendships blossomed and her fellow prisoners became like a family to her. Their shared experiences and support had helped them to cope with the challenges of incarceration, making their bonds all the more significant. Packing a suitcase wasn't necessary for Zoe. She didn't have any personal belongings to pack. Instead, she would be given back the clothes she had arrived in, the same attire she wore on the day her sentence began. This simple act of putting on her old clothes would mark the first step towards re-entering a world that had undoubtedly changed during her time behind bars. Zoe hadn't planned any special farewell with her friends to commemorate her departure. As she prepared to leave, she noticed the envious glances from some of the inmates who still had time left on their sentences. These lingering gazes served as a reminder that not everyone was fortunate enough to regain their freedom just yet. "So it's your time, huh? Wow. It really has been 10 years. I can't believe it," Zoe's cellmate remarked, her voice tinged with disbelief and a hint of sadness. "Yeah, me neither. It feels weird," Zoe replied, her own emotions wavering as the reality of her departure began to sink in. During the last 7 days, Zoe's sleep had been disrupted by the constant worry surrounding her impending release. Despite her anxiety, Zoe attempted to go about her daily routine, doing what she had done every day for the past 10 years. She hoped that by sticking to her familiar habits, she could find some semblance of comfort amid the tumultuous emotions she was experiencing. The day was bright and sunny as Zoe stepped outside of the prison, squinting as the sun's rays hit her face. A gentle breeze ruffled her hair, providing a refreshing contrast to the warmth. As she looked around, she realized that there was no one waiting for her. The only person in the whole wide world who would have eagerly awaited her release was Zoe's mother. But sadly, she had passed away the previous year, leaving Zoe to face her newfound freedom alone. Zoe had never known her father, and with her mother gone, she was truly on her own. She made her way to the bus stop, where a few people were already waiting for the bus that would take them into the city. Once the bus arrived, Zoe boarded and found a seat, positioning herself by the window. As the bus began its journey, she gazed outside, lost in thought, watching the world pass by. People outside seemed to move about freely, a stark contrast to the life Zoe had known for the past decade. She leaned her head against the window and quietly sobbed, reflecting on the 10 years that were now behind her. Those years had been filled with worry, fear, and pain that seemed to stretch on indefinitely, making her feel as though her release day would never arrive. One aspect of her life that had been left behind was her career. Zoe held a degree in nursing and had been an outstanding specialist in her field. The prison's elderly doctor had even jokingly told her, "I know it sounds silly, but I wish you could stay here a bit longer. I'm going to have a hard time without your help, to be honest." Despite the humor, Zoe knew that her skills had made a difference during her time in prison. Now, as she ventured back into the outside world, she wondered if she could reclaim her place as a skilled professional. Although the old doctor had joked with her, Zoe didn't particularly appreciate his sense of humor. She had observed how he often treated inmates as if they were lesser beings, more like animals than people. In contrast, Zoe had always been much more caring and attentive when it came to her fellow inmates. She believed that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, deserved compassion and respect. Due to the lack of medicines within the prison, Zoe had been forced to devise her own methods for treating various ailments. She tended to her fellow inmates' migraines, arthritis, hernias, and other illnesses, using her resourcefulness and empathy. Her reputation as a skilled and compassionate healer spread, leading to long lines of people seeking her help. At times, even the prison guards approached her for advice and recommendations on treatments, acknowledging her expertise despite her circumstances. While riding the bus, Zoe's thoughts turned to her future employment prospects. She wondered who would be willing to hire an ex-convict, particularly someone with an armed robbery charge on their record. The thought weighed heavily on her mind. Would anyone in their right mind trust her enough to let her into their workspace? The challenge of overcoming the stigma associated with her past seemed daunting, but she knew she had to try. It seemed to Zoe that nobody cared about the fact that she wasn't a dangerous criminal, but rather just an ordinary person who had been dealt a bad hand in life and found herself framed for a crime. The label of ex-convict didn't differentiate between those who were truly dangerous and those who were simply victims of circumstance, and this weighed heavily on her as she contemplated her future. It all started because of Zach, who was strong, brave, and bold. Zoe used to be swept away just by the sound of his deep voice. They first met when Zoe was providing care for Mrs. Andrews, Zach's elderly grandmother. The devoted grandson was always courteous, showering his grandma with gifts and sweets. He displayed genuine politeness and care for her well-being, which endeared him to Zoe even more. His outwardly kind nature had made it difficult for Zoe to see through his intentions, and ultimately led her down a path she would never have chosen for herself. One day, Zach invited Zoe to a lavish restaurant and spared no expense, showering her with extravagant delicacies. The two were drawn to each other, and it wasn't long before they were caught up in a passionate love affair. However, their happiness was short-lived, as the police unexpectedly knocked on Zoe's door one day. Despite the cries and screams of her distraught mother, they took Zoe away, changing the course of her life forever. As her case was being investigated, Zoe gradually uncovered the truth about Zach. He wasn't the noble prince she had believed him to be, but rather a deceitful crook. Zoe had a keychain with keys to her patients' homes, as people trusted the young caregiver with access to their houses. In some cases, they had no other choice. They were simply too weak to get up and answer the door themselves, and it wasn't practical to constantly rely on relatives for assistance. Unbeknownst to Zoe, this trust she had earned from her patients would be exploited by the very person she had fallen in love with. Zach had taken advantage of the keys in Zoe's possession and robbed several apartments. Eventually, he was apprehended by the police, but instead of owning up to his crimes, he shifted the blame onto Zoe. He claimed that she was the mastermind behind all the robberies, painting her as the brains behind the criminal operation. This turn of events devastated Zoe, as not only had she been betrayed by the man she loved, but she now faced the possibility of being wrongly convicted for crimes she didn't commit. Zoe's life crumbled like a house of cards, and she found herself on the brink of ending her own life. But fate had other plans, as an elderly woman named Amy came to rescue her. Amy was a wise, older inmate who was serving time for accidentally killing her abusive husband. Despite her own struggles, Amy's arrival proved to be a turning point for Zoe. The two women formed a bond that would provide Zoe with the support and strength she needed to face the challenges that lay ahead. "Don't even think about that, Zoe," Amy warned firmly. "You're so young and beautiful. Whatever happens, just keep doing good and forget about the past. You'll see what happens, mark my words." Those words resonated with Zoe and would stay with her for years to come, serving as a source of comfort and motivation during her darkest moments. Zoe reached her stop and stepped out of the bus, scanning her surroundings for any familiar features of the streets and buildings. It had been 10 years since she last saw this place, and she knew that much had changed. Her favorite coffee shop was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a bank office. As she walked along the streets, Zoe couldn't help but feel disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The once familiar neighborhood was now filled with new shops, restaurants, and buildings that she didn't recognize. Zoe walked towards her home, and as she approached the overgrown yard, a sense of nostalgia washed over her. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness as she realized how much the place had changed since she last saw it. The yard, which used to be meticulously maintained, was now overgrown and unkempt. The front porch, where she used to spend countless hours chatting with her mother, was now empty and lifeless. Despite the dilapidation, Zoe felt a sense of comfort and familiarity in returning to her childhood home. She knew that she had a long road ahead of her, but in this moment, she allowed herself to simply bask in the memories of her past. Zoe walked into the silent house, devoid of any signs or sounds of her mother's presence. She sank down onto the couch and buried her face in her palms, feeling the weight of her grief and loss wash over her. She couldn't help but imagine her poor mother, crying alone, unable to afford a good lawyer to help her daughter during the trial. The pain of this realization brought tears to Zoe's eyes, and she cried silently for the mother who would never be able to welcome her back home. She knew that she had to find a way to move forward and make the most of the life that she had been given, but the sense of loss and sorrow was overwhelming. Despite the overwhelming emotions she was feeling, Zoe was determined not to shed any more tears. She stood up and walked towards the mirror, staring at her reflection. With a steely resolve, she ordered herself to smile, even if it felt forced. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Zoe realized that this would be a long and difficult journey, but she was determined to make the most of it. She knew that she had the strength and resilience to overcome any obstacle that lay in her path, and with that thought, she straightened her posture, took a deep breath, and stepped forward into her new life. "Come on, pull up your socks," Zoe muttered to herself, staring determinedly at her own reflection in the mirror. "No complaints, no regrets, you can do this." With renewed determination, Zoe set to work cleaning and tidying up the house. She grabbed a bucket and a mop and began scrubbing the floors, determined to make the most of the life she had been given. Despite the overwhelming sense of loss and grief, Zoe knew that she had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. A week later, Zoe received a phone call from her old friend Hannah, whom she used to work with. Hannah had been in touch with Zoe's mother and had learned of her release from prison through her. Zoe was grateful to hear a friendly voice on the other end of the line and eagerly caught up with her old friend, sharing stories about what had happened in the years since they last spoke. For a moment, Zoe was transported back to a time where her life had been turned upside down, and it felt good to have a sense of normalcy again. "So, what's the plan now?" Hannah asked. "I need a job to feed myself to begin with," Zoe replied. "Actually, you know what? We've got to meet as soon as possible. I think I can help you with just that. I was offered a very well-paying job recently, but I can't leave my current job. Why don't you take it?" Hannah suddenly perked up. "Don't even worry about the resume. Nobody cares about it at that job, trust me." Hannah met with Zoe and told her about a wealthy family who was looking for a caregiver who could handle intense stress. The family's son had been in a terrible car accident and was now paralyzed. Due to the patient's nasty personality, many caregivers had just quit days after starting their work. The father was desperate and willing to hire anyone who could take care of his son, regardless of their background, as long as they could handle the unpleasant antics of the son. When Hannah mentioned the salary, Zoe's eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe that she would earn enough to live for a year, and even afford a better tombstone for her mother's grave. Despite her excitement, she was also apprehensive about taking on the role of caregiver for a difficult patient. However, with Hannah's encouragement, Zoe agreed to give it a try. 3 days later, Zoe found herself standing in front of a massive mansion. A stern-looking security guard demanded to see her ID before allowing her inside. Zoe felt her nerves getting the best of her, but she tried her best to remain calm and composed. As she made her way through the grand entrance and into the foyer, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the opulence that surrounded her. The furnishings were all ornate and looked incredibly expensive, and the space seemed to go on forever. It was a stark contrast to her own modest apartment and reminded her of the gaping disparity in wealth in society. The house was pompous and grand, unlike anything Zoe had ever seen before, even on TV. No amount of screen time could have conveyed the true greatness of the mansion. As Zoe followed the important-looking servant through the corridors, she couldn't help but marvel at the sheer size and opulence of everything around her. Every room seemed to be larger and more luxurious than the last, and Zoe felt increasingly overwhelmed. Eventually, they arrived at a massive hall that reminded Zoe of a train station vestibule. The ceiling soared so high that she felt like she was standing at the bottom of a well. Enormous chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm yellow glow across the room. The walls were lined with paintings and sculptures, and Zoe could see that every detail had been meticulously designed to convey a sense of grandeur and wealth. Zoe tried her best to appear calm and collected, even though her nerves were getting the better of her. As Zoe entered the hall, she couldn't help but notice the big oak table that dominated the center of the room. A gray-haired man was sitting at the table, and he gestured for her to take a seat across from him. Zoe approached the table and sat down, feeling the cold and intelligent eyes of the owner staring directly at her. The man was impeccably dressed, and every detail of his appearance exuded wealth and power. Zoe felt small and insignificant in his presence, but she tried her best to maintain her composure. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a large grandfather clock in the corner. Zoe felt as if she were in a movie, and this was a pivotal scene where the hero meets the villain. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man spoke. His voice was low and measured, and he spoke with the authority of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his eyes never leaving Zoe's. "My son is a difficult patient, as I'm sure you've been told. I've gone through countless caregivers, and none of them have been able to handle his behavior. But I sense something different about you, Miss Zoe," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Zoe," he repeated, "I believe you have the potential to succeed where others have failed, and I'm willing to offer you a generous compensation for your services. But be warned, my son is not an easy person to deal with. My name is Frank Duncan," the man introduced himself, his voice smooth and measured. "I'm Justin's father. My son is ill, and I need someone who is patient and experienced to care for him. I want to be clear with you from the start that I don't tolerate people who get hysterical over trivial matters. If you're the type of person who makes a scene out of every little thing, then you can turn around and leave right now. I need you to be honest with me and let me know if you're up for the challenge." Zoe listened carefully to Frank's words, taking in his steely gaze and stern expression. She knew that she would need to tread carefully if she wanted to succeed in this role. Zoe nodded her head in affirmation. Relieved that she had passed Frank's initial test, he picked up his phone and dialed someone, and a few moments later, an old lady entered the hall. "Zoe, this is Mrs. Whaley, our housekeeper," Frank said, gesturing to the woman. "Mrs. Whaley, this is Zoe. She'll be taking care of Justin. Please show her everything she needs to know." Zoe noticed that Mr. Duncan's demeanor had changed, and he seemed to have lost interest in her almost immediately. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment, but she shrugged it off and focused on Mrs. Whaley, who turned out to be a sweet and tactful person. Whaley gave Zoe a warm smile, and the two of them began to chat as they walked through the mansion. Mrs. Whaley showed Zoe the various rooms she would need to use, including the kitchen, laundry room, and Justin's bedroom. She gave Zoe detailed instructions on how to care for Justin and warned her about some of his more difficult behaviors. "He can be quite stubborn at times," Mrs. Whaley confided in a low voice, "but he's a good boy at heart. He just needs someone who is patient and caring to look after him." Zoe listened intently to Mrs. Whaley's advice, grateful for the insider knowledge. Finally, she led Zoe to the room where she would be staying. The room was small but cozy, with a comfortable-looking bed and a window that overlooked the garden. Zoe felt a sense of relief as she looked around the room, grateful for a space to call her own in this massive mansion. "Is there anything else you need, dear?" Mrs. Whaley asked, her eyes twinkling with kindness. Zoe shook her head, feeling a sense of gratitude towards the older woman. "Nope, this is perfect. Thank you so much for showing me around, Mrs. Whaley. I really appreciate it." Mrs. Whaley smiled warmly at Zoe, patting her hand affectionately. "You're welcome, dear. We're all here to support you in any way we can. Now, let's get you settled in, shall we? You can take a shower, wear the uniform, and start your work. Call me when you're ready. I will introduce you to Justin. You'll find everything you need in that closet." "Great," Zoe replied, feeling grateful for Mrs. Whaley's help. "Thank you again for everything." Mrs. Whaley gave Zoe one last smile before departing, leaving Zoe alone in the room. Zoe took a good look around the room, feeling a sense of relief that she had a private space to call her own. She was grateful for the spaciousness and brightness of the room, which helped to alleviate some of her initial nerves. As she inspected the room, Zoe noticed that there was a bathroom and a toilet attached to the room, which made things even more convenient for her. She saw a uniform hanging in the closet, and she immediately changed into it, feeling a sense of professionalism wash over her. She knew that this was a serious job, and she wanted to make sure that she was dressed appropriately. Zoe also took note of the medical room located just across from her new residence. She peeked inside and was amazed to see the latest medical tools and equipment laid out in neat rows. She knew that she would need to be well prepared to handle any medical emergencies that might arise, and she felt grateful that the resources were so easily accessible. Feeling fresh and ready to start her new job, Zoe took a shower and got dressed in her uniform. She felt nervous but determined to do her best as she prepared to meet Justin for the first time. She took a deep breath and called Mrs. Whaley to let her know that she was ready. Later that evening, Mrs. Whaley led Zoe to the living room, which looked more like a throne room than a typical living space. The ceilings were high and the furnishings were ornate and luxurious. Zoe felt a twinge of nervousness as she followed Mrs. Whaley into the room. Sitting on a plush sofa was a beautiful woman who Zoe recognized as Mrs. Cassandra Duncan, Frank's wife. Despite her high status, Mrs. Duncan looked young and fresh, and she appeared to be at ease in the opulent surroundings. To Zoe's surprise, Mrs. Duncan greeted her warmly, and they quickly established their rapport. "Welcome, Zoe. It's so nice to finally meet you," Mrs. Duncan said, extending her hand. "I hope you're settling in well." Zoe felt a sense of relief at Mrs. Duncan's friendly demeanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Duncan. Yes, everything is going well so far." They chatted for a while, discussing everything from Justin's condition to Zoe's own background and interests. Zoe was struck by how kind and down-to-earth Mrs. Duncan seemed, despite her wealth and status. As the conversation wound down, Mrs. Duncan looked at Zoe with a serious expression. "I want you to know that we're counting on you, Zoe. Justin is a very difficult patient, and we've been through many caregivers before you. We're putting our trust in you, and we expect you to do your best for him." Zoe nodded her head in understanding, feeling a sense of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Zoe, don't be scared, all right?" Mrs. Duncan said, her eyes full of kindness. "I know you've probably heard a lot about Justin, but he's not a monster. He's a bit spoiled and the accident changed him a lot, but deep down, he's a good person. I haven't been paying attention to his antics, but I know he can be difficult to handle. As a stepmother, Justin can't stand me, but I hope you'll be able to establish a good relationship with him." Zoe listened to Mrs. Duncan's words, feeling a sense of reassurance wash over her. She knew that this job would be tough, but it was comforting to hear that Justin wasn't the monster that some had made him out to be. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Duncan," Zoe replied, determined to make a good impression. "Thank you for your advice and support. Call me Cassandra," Mrs. Duncan said, smiling warmly. "We're all in this together, Zoe. And remember, if you ever need anything, just let me know." Cassandra smiled charmingly, her warm expression contrasting with the coldness in Justin's gaze. As Zoe entered the room, she took a moment to observe him. He looked a lot like his father, with the same sharp features and piercing eyes. Justin was sitting in an armchair, staring into the crackling fire in the fireplace. He didn't acknowledge Zoe's presence or reply to her greetings. Undeterred, Zoe confidently walked up to Justin, determined to make a connection with him. She stood in front of him, waiting for him to acknowledge her. When he continued to ignore her, Zoe took a deep breath and spoke. "Hello, Justin. My name is Zoe. I'm going to be your caregiver from now on. I'm here to help you in any way that I can." Justin remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. Zoe waited patiently, not wanting to push too hard too soon. She took in her surroundings, noting the rich furnishings and artwork that adorned the room. She wondered what it must be like to live in such luxury. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Justin turned his head to look at her. His gaze was cold and piercing, and Zoe felt a shiver run down her spine, but she held his stare, refusing to back down. After a moment, Justin spoke in a low, gravely voice. "I don't need your help," he said flatly. "I can take care of myself." Zoe felt a twinge of frustration at his stubbornness, but she remained calm and professional. "I understand that you're used to being independent, Justin," she replied evenly. "But I'm here to make things easier for you. I can help you with anything you need, whether it's getting dressed or preparing a meal. I'm here to support you, not take away your independence." "You need to come with me for an inspection," Zoe said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Who are you to tell me to follow you?" Justin roared back, his tone angry and confrontational. Zoe felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she knew that she needed to remain calm and professional. She quietly walked around the wheelchair and gently began pushing it towards the medical room, ignoring Justin's angry outburst. At that moment, a stream of expletives rained down on Zoe, but she was not easily intimidated. As someone who had spent time in prison, she was no stranger to being on the receiving end of verbal abuse. Zoe pushed the wheelchair towards the medical room, ignoring Justin's screams and threats. She knew that this was part of the job, and she tried not to take his outbursts personally. Despite his antics, Zoe calmly inspected Justin in the medical room, checking his vital signs and assessing his overall condition. The accident had left him with severe injuries, but his arms still moved and his reflexes were intact. It wasn't the worst case that Zoe had seen, and she felt a sense of relief that he was not completely paralyzed. As Zoe settled back into her room, her thoughts turned to Justin and the challenges that lay ahead. She knew that she needed to come up with a plan to help him, something that would improve his physical condition and also help him to trust her. As she pondered her options, a memory from her time in prison came to mind. She had developed a unique physical therapy technique that had helped many of her fellow inmates to recover from injuries and illnesses. It was a combination of yoga, massage, and strength training, and it had proven to be very effective. Zoe wondered if this technique would help Justin as well. She knew that it was a long shot, but she was willing to try anything that might help him to heal and recover. The next day, she approached Justin with her idea, explaining the basic principles of her technique and how it had helped others in the past. "Justin, why don't we try the special massage and exercise routine? I think it'll be very helpful for you in combination with the medicine you're taking," Zoe suggested. "Go away," was Justin's response, but Zoe didn't back down. She rolled up his sleeves and gave him a tranquilizer to help him relax. Life in the mansion continued, with Mr. and Mrs. Duncan mostly away from home, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Whaley, quietly doing her job without asking too many questions. Zoe had a quiet and calm life in the large castle, but Justin kept her busy with his needs and tantrums. Despite Justin's attempts to humiliate her, Zoe remained calm and professional. She would clean up after him when he threw things and continue with her work even when he insulted her. But one day, after he spit in her face during a reflex check, Zoe stood upright and addressed Justin in a quiet but firm voice. "Mr. Duncan, I envy your boldness. I am an ex-convict, by the way. Are you really not scared?" To her surprise, Justin looked at her with renewed interest, and for the first time, he seemed to see her as more than just his caregiver. He asked her what she had done, and Zoe proudly replied, "Murder and dismemberment." After that conversation, Justin stopped spitting and insulting Zoe. He seemed to have a newfound respect for her, and he allowed her to continue with her procedures without any more disruptions. Zoe felt a sense of satisfaction that she had been able to break through to Justin, and she knew that their relationship had taken a new turn. Days passed, and a month later, Zoe was summoned to meet with Mr. Duncan. "What have you decided? Staying?" Frank asked. "Until I'm done with my course?" "Yes," Zoe replied. "Good job. You remind me of John Dark. You have the same proud poise. I'm glad you're not giving up. I wouldn't take his words to heart. He's a good kid, just not too lucky." Frank went on to explain that Justin was not only depressed because of his broken spine, but also because of the betrayal of his ex-fiancée, Christine. They had been at a private party, and Justin had asked the driver to take him and Christine home. But when Christine started dancing with another man to make Justin jealous, he had lost his temper and driven recklessly, causing a terrible crash. Christine had walked away with a few scratches, but Justin was now bound to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. "I promise he will get up," Zoe said quietly to Frank. His cold eyes filled up with tears. "You know what? I'm not a perfect father. I've done so much evil in life. Justin's mother died young. She couldn't take it anymore. She was tired of being afraid for her son and me. This fortune of mine is stained with blood. I guess I'm paying for it now. My second wife, Cassandra, is a good woman. She did her best to become a mother to Justin, but he was like a beast, and that's another payment." Zoe listened, and when Frank was done, she spoke. "When I was in prison, a wise old woman once told me, 'Do good and forget about it. Perhaps you need to do the same.'" By this time, Frank had already wept quietly. He stood up and asked if he could hug Zoe. They stood hugging for a while, and Frank said, "You are our guardian angel. Thank you." Once, Zoe asked for some time off. The anniversary of her mother's passing was approaching, and she still had to put a tombstone on her grave. Zoe thought she could handle everything in 3 days. Frank agreed, and Zoe left. She finished everything in the city. The cross on her mother's grave looked beautiful and sturdy. She planted some flowers and ordered an elegant fence. The master said it would be ready by Whitsunday. When she returned to the mansion, she found Cassandra upset. It was clear that she had cried a lot. She was standing dressed to leave and leaning on a suitcase with wheels. "I have to say goodbye to you, Zoe. Justin slandered me and told Frank that I had been cheating on him multiple times. Frank didn't even want to hear what I had to say." Zoe, mad at what Justin did, stormed into his room infuriated. She walked up to him. and slapped him across the face as hard as she could. "Rascal, if she leaves, I'm leaving too. You can keep feeling sorry for yourself and your miserable fate." Justin didn't expect that coming. Angry, he screamed, "I don't care. I will keep feeling sorry for myself. We'll figure it out with Dad. Did you have some good time off? It must have been fun partying when you're getting paid this much, huh? You're all the same. Can be bought and sold." "How dare you say these things, you scoundrel?" Zoe asked. "I can say whatever I want. I've been sitting here all alone while you were away all these days, partying and having fun." Justin's eyes were red with madness. He grabbed Zoe and started shaking her furiously. Zoe jerked out of his arms and ran away. Justin got up and screamed in desperation. "Stop, I said. I hate you, you fool. I can't live without you." Justin fell on the floor. Zoe froze in her tracks, stunned by what she saw. Her method worked. Justin was able to get up on his feet on his own. She ran back and propped him back up on the wheelchair. Suddenly, Justin hugged Zoe and kissed her. "I love you more than anything in the world. I'm ready to die for you. I thought I was going to die of jealousy." Zoe was crying. She wiped away her tears and said, "Why did you hurt Cassandra? Apologize, please." Justin immediately dialed her number. The same night, he asked for her forgiveness in front of his father. "Cassandra, I am not proud of what I had done. I was honestly an a-hole. I would get on my knees if I could. I don't know how else I could redeem myself. I'm so sorry." Justin kissed her hands and cried. Cassandra smiled. "All right, you will get well and have a chance to get on your knees, I think," Cassandra said and looked at Zoe. Justin confessed his love to Zoe and asked for her hand. Zoe was taken aback by Justin's sudden confession of love. She had never seen this side of him before. Despite his previous behavior towards her, Zoe had to admit that Justin had changed a lot since she first arrived at the mansion. But Zoe was hesitant to give him an answer. She had always been wary of getting too close to people, especially those with a lot of money and power. She didn't want to end up being used or hurt again. "Justin, I appreciate your honesty and I'm glad to see how much you've changed, but I can't give you an answer right now. I need some time to think," Zoe said. Justin looked crestfallen, but he understood. He promised to give her all the time she needed. Over the next few weeks, Justin was doing everything he could to prove his love for her. Gradually, Zoe started to see a different side of Justin. He wasn't the spoiled brat she had first met. He was kind, caring, and compassionate. Zoe started to fall in love with him too. One day, Justin and Zoe were at a beautiful beach. As Zoe pushed Justin along the shore, he asked her to put him on the ground. He sat on the sand leaning on his wheelchair and pulled out a small box. "Zoe, I know I haven't always been the best person, but I promise to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Will you marry me?" Justin asked, looking up at her with hopeful eyes. Zoe was overcome with emotion. She knew that she loved Justin and that he had truly changed for the better. Without hesitation, she said yes. From that moment on, Zoe and Justin's relationship blossomed. They were married in a beautiful ceremony in the mansion's gardens, surrounded by their closest friends and family. Frank blessed them. Justin eventually did get on his feet. He was walking with a cane though, but his now wife Zoe laughed. "This is just the beginning. You're gonna run one day." Mr. Duncan invested most of his fortune into an important business. A new clinic opened in the city. It had the latest equipment and the staff was highly qualified. But the most important thing was that it was free. Zoe was the manager of the clinic. The clinic was a huge success. Patients from all over the city came to receive medical attention, and they were all amazed at the quality of the care they received. Zoe had hired only the best doctors and nurses, and she made sure that every patient was treated with respect and dignity. As time went by, the clinic expanded its services. They offered free vaccinations, dental care, and even psychological counseling. The clinic became a beacon of hope for the less fortunate members of the community, and Zoe was very proud of what she had accomplished. Justin, meanwhile, had found his calling as a motivational speaker. He had turned his life around and was now using his experience to inspire others. He traveled around the country, giving speeches about overcoming adversity and never giving up on your dreams. Zoe and Justin's love for each other only grew stronger with time. They were a true power couple, working together to make the world a better place. And as they looked back on their journey, they realized that their paths had crossed for a reason. They had both been given a second chance at life, and they were determined to make the most of it.